How are you guys doing? It is Thursday, September 3rd, 2020. I here in this quarantine. I'm James Sims. And for this episode of The Elite with the Houston Rockets clinching the Western Conference Semifinals last night, I was going to do a piece previewing the semifinal round of the NBA playoffs. And I know it's kind of late because there are two series in which teams have already won. They're already halfway to making it to the Eastern Conference Finals. But now that every team is clinched, I'm just going to walk you through each series and how each team got there and what I think the series is, or how the series are going to go. Because I think every single team that I thought would win their series would win their series. So I'm doing pretty well so far. Now, in the semis, now it gets kind of tough. So, without further ado, I'm going to dive into it. And now, because the East Conference is starting right now, I might as well get started on that one. So, the first series to look out for in the Eastern Conference is between the number 2 seed Toronto Raptors and the 3 seed Boston Celtics, because they were the first two teams to advance through their rounds. They're the only matchup that met up in the second round after sweeping the first round. So going into the series, both teams entered undefeated. First, starting out with the Nets-Raptors series. The Nets, the Nets were a team that were kind of out of the Raptors league because the East wasn't as strong as the West. The West had more playoff level teams, and the East just had less teams that were on the level of like the play. I think it stopped after 6 with the Sixers, and it kind of showed. The Brooklyn Nets, they were a good team, and with Kyrie and KD next year, they'll be great. But as of yesterday, I think the Raptors, they kind of put them in their rear view and just left them behind. And you can kind of see it in this first series where they're playing the Celtics, whereas the Celtics were playing the Sixers for a full series and the Raptors were playing the Nets. You can see the difference in preparation for which team is actually ready. But yeah, the Raptors would beat the Nets by 24 the first game. They beat them by 5 the second game, beat them by 25 the third, and they beat them by 28 in the fourth. So in only one game, it really, really went down to the end. Fred VanVleet and Pascal Siakam will be the two players that averaged 20 points a game in the series. So those are the two players that I would most definitely look forward to in this series. Marc Gasol also pitched in with 6 points. He pitched in with 6 points, 4 rebounds. Also, Serge Ibaka had a big series with averaging 19 points and 10 rebounds in 23 minutes. He's made all of his free throws. So, and he's shooting 63% from the field, 57% from three. So, the Raptors definitely they had a bunch of players that were playing incredibly well in the first round. And now jumping to the Sixers versus the Celtics. It was a much tougher series and a lot of the games were closer. The Celtics beat the Sixers by 8 in the first game. They beat the Sixers by 27 in the second game. But in the third game, they beat them by 8. In the fourth game, they beat them by 4. So them being in the game with Philly for 3 of the 4 games versus 1 of the 4 games for the Raptors shows that the Celtics they're going to come into this series a lot more prepared. And because the Raptors are kind of lacking that one guy, and even alongside Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown, the Celtics do still have Kemba Walker, Al Horford, Marcus Smart, and some veteran players who have actually been in the league for a hot minute. In addition to that, the Celtics had 3 players that averaged 20 points in the previous series. Jaylen Brown averaged 21 points, 6 rebounds, and 2.5 assists, along with a steal. Kemba Walker averaged 24 points, 4 rebounds, and 3.8 assists, and a steal in less minutes, but he still averaged that from the previous series. And Jason Tatum averaged 27 points, almost 10 rebounds, 2.5 steals, and 2.5 blocks per game in that last series. So I think the way that the Celtics are performing right now and how they're coming off their last series and how much better of a competitor, how much better the Sixers prepared them for this series than the Nets prepared the Raptors for this series. I wouldn't say they're easily going to get rid of the Raptors, but I think the Celtics after these first 2 games, I think the Raptors might take 2 of the next 3, but I think the Celtics will close this series out in 6 pretty handily so they can meet up with I think they're going to meet up with the Bucks still in the Eastern Conference Finals. So jumping out to the Bucks series. First, giving you a little bit of context of how the Bucks got there. First, they took on the 8 seed Orlando Magic, and in their first game of that series, the Orlando Magic were able to jump out, surprise the Milwaukee Bucks, and take the first game of the season, or take the first game of the playoffs. The Magic beat them by 12. But in the second game, the Bucks would come back and completely destroy them. The second game, they beat them by 15. The third game, they beat them by 14. The fourth game, they beat them by 15, and the fifth game, they beat them by 14. So they beat them pretty handily when they started winning. All of their wins were by double digits, showing that they were the better team in the building, most definitely. But just going down how the players, because just looking at how they did, right? Along the way, they had 4 players that averaged double-digit points. Eric Bledsoe averaged 11.6 points and 6.6 assists per game, over a steal a game, and 3.3 rebounds. Brook Lopez, their center, would average 13.4 points. He'd also average 4.4 rebounds and 1.2 steals a game. Chris Middleton would average 15 points, over 7 rebounds, over 5 assists. And Giannis Antetokounmpo, the reigning NBA MVP, would average 30.6 points, 16 rebounds, 6 assists, all while shooting 59% from the field, 39% from 3, and 62% from the line in the 5 games of this series, where he kind of just took over and showed why he was one of the best players in the NBA. So that's how the Bucks got there. And the Heat got there as the 5th seed taking on the 4th seed Indiana Pacers. And unlike the Bucks, they didn't lose in their first series. And I think they faced off against a harder team than the Bucks had to face off against, and they swept them. And I think the Heat were more prepared. But going into that last series, they beat the Pacers, who were the seed that were the team that were a seed above them. They beat them by 12 in the first game. They beat them by 9 in game 2. They beat them by 9 in game 3, and they beat them by 12 in game 4. So I mean, they beat those teams pretty handily by an average of double digits. And just to lead the way, they had 5 double-digit scores. They had 6 scorers score over 9 points. Jay Crowder scored 9.8 points per game and 6.5 rebounds. Duncan Robinson averaged 12.5 points. Bam Adebayo averaged 15 points, 11 rebounds, 5 assists, a steal, and a block per game. Tyler Hero averaged 16.5 points, 4 rebounds, 3.5 assists as a rookie. All while shooting 36% from 3, 45% from the field. So he's been killing it. Jimmy Butler averaged 19.8 points per game, 5 rebounds, 4 steals, 2.5 steals, and a block for those 4 games. Goran Dragic would average over 28 points, 4 rebounds, 5 assists, and over a steal a game. So that's how the Heat are coming into this series. And looking at the momentum that both of these teams have, I think that after Miami, because I think Miami took on a harder team and they were better prepared for this series. I think the Bucks have just about figured Miami out, and I don't think the Bucks are gonna I think this series will go to a game 7 if Miami because I don't think the Bucks are gonna win the next 4 games, but it's very possible. I think the Bucks still seize control of this series, and the Bucks still go on to win it. More than likely 4-3, but I'm gonna go out and just say I think the Bucks are gonna win the rest of the games this series. But that's how they enter these series. But right now those series they're going on at this very moment. And if you were to call my prediction, I think it's gonna be a rematch of last year's Eastern Conference not a rematch. I'm sorry, but I think the Bucks will face off against the Boston Celtics. No, they will have a playoff rematch of last year's second round match, but this time it'll be in the Eastern Conference Finals. But jumping into the Western Conference now, the first series that will start today is going to happen between the 2nd seed Los Angeles Clippers and the 3rd seed Denver Nuggets. Starting off with the Clippers, they were the first of the 2 teams to advance to this round after beating the 7 seed Dallas Mavericks in 6 games. In the first game, they beat the Mavericks by 8. In the second game, they lost to the Mavericks by 13. In the third game, they beat the Mavericks by 8. In the fourth game, they lost to the Mavericks by 2. In the fifth game, they beat the Mavericks by 43 points. And in the sixth game, they beat them by 14. With Luka Doncic leading the way for the Mavericks and Kawhi Leonard leading the way, of course, for the leading the way for the Clippers the whole way. So, I mean, out of the Clippers, they were there. They had 5 players that had averaged 10 points a game. So, like, and they also they had 2 players that averaged at least 9. Let's talk about Let's talk about their top 7 performers in the first round, just to give you a little bit of context into how they're going to approach the Denver series. Off the bench, they had Montrezl Harrell, who averaged 9 points, 3 rebounds, and almost a block a game in the series. You had Reggie Jackson there. We had Reggie Jackson off the bench, who started a game, who would go on to average 9.3 points. 3 rebounds and over an assist a game. And then out of the starters, Ivica Zubac would go on to average 11 points and 7 rebounds. Marcus Morris as a starter would average 12.8 points, over 5 rebounds, 2 assists, and over a steal a game. Lou Williams off the bench would average 16 points, 3 rebounds, 4 assists in 27 minutes per game. Paul George as their second piece, their elite wing he went on to average 18.5 points per game, 6.8 rebounds, 4 assists, and their top performer was, of course, their GOAT level player Kawhi Leonard, who would average 32.8 points, 10.2 rebounds, 5.2 assists, over 2.3 steals, and half a block a game for the Los Angeles Clippers. And then jumping to see how the Nuggets performers were doing. Because, I mean, the Nuggets went on to beat the Utah Jazz in 7 games after originally going down 3-1 in the series. And they're carrying a lot of momentum with them into this series. In the first game, they beat the Jazz by 10. They lost game 2 to the Jazz by 19. They lost game 3 to the Jazz by 37. They lost game 4 to the Jazz by 2, and they would go on to beat the Jazz in game 5 by 10. They beat the Jazz in game 6 by 12, and they beat the Jazz in game 7 by 2 points, 1 possession. So, I mean, just looking into their top performers, they had 4 double-digit scorers. They have 4 double-digit scorers coming into the series. Jeremy Grant would average 11 points per game. He would start 4, and he started in 4 of the games. He would average over an assist, and he would average a block per game. Michael Porter Jr., their young guy who only started in 3 of their games, went on to average 12, 7 rebounds. Nikola Jokic, their elite center, would average 26 points, 8 rebounds, 5 assists, and their top scorer was Jamal Murray, who averaged 31 points, over 5 rebounds, over 6 assists per game. So if we look at both of these teams, I mean, you can just tell it's a tale of 2 teams. You have one team that's derived mainly based off of just depth and a lot of team success, and then you have a lot of 1-2 ball on the Denver Nuggets. I think in just the playing styles, I don't want to say the Nuggets are out of the Clippers league. I think they're gonna win a couple games, whereas whereas the Mavericks got about 2 wins on the Clippers, I think at best the Nuggets will get about 2 wins on the Clippers as well. I don't think they take this series to 7 games. If I were to take this completely seriously, I think that the Clippers have turned it on, and I believe the Clippers will. I think the Clippers beat the Nuggets in 5. I don't think I think the Mavericks would have beat the Nuggets this year. And the Nuggets were very, very close to losing to the Jazz. And I don't know. Too much of their success is between those 2 players. And I don't think they have enough. They have the team depth, but I don't think they have the depth to match up with the Clippers, because the only way you beat the Clippers is if you beat them on superstar power or depth, and they beat them on neither front. They beat them on neither front. So that's the team I think will advance out of this one. And then jumping to the other seed, the other playoff matchup in the West, it'll happen between the top seed Los Angeles Lakers and the 4th seed Houston Rockets. First, starting off with the Los Angeles Lakers, they were the very first team to advance. They advanced in 5 games. In the first game, they lost to the Portland Trail Blazers by 7. In the second game, they beat the Portland Trail Blazers by 23 points. In game 3, they beat them by 8. In Game 4, they beat them by 20, and in Game 5, they beat them by 9 points. For the Los Angeles Lakers, here's the story for them. They would have 4 double-digit scores. Kyle Kuzma would average 10 points, 4 rebounds. Kentavious Caldwell-Pope would average 11 points for the series. LeBron James would average 27 points, 10 rebounds, 10 assists, and a steal. A triple-double, by the way, in his first playoff series as a Laker. And Anthony Davis would be the top scorer for the team, averaging 29.8 points, 9.4 rebounds, 4.2 assists, over a steal and over a block per game for the Lakers. So that's what's going on. That's how the Lakers into this. And then we look at it from the Houston Rockets standpoint, where the Houston Rockets, like I said, just last night advanced to the Western Conference Semifinals after beating the 5th seed Oklahoma City Thunder in 7 games. In the first game, they beat the Oklahoma City Thunder by 15. In the second game, they beat the Thunder by 13. In the third game, they lost to the Thunder by 12. In the fourth game, they lost to the Thunder by 3. In the fifth game, they beat the Thunder by 34. In the sixth game, they lost to the Thunder by 4, and in Game 7, they beat them by 2. Literally a block by James Harden helped get them into this position where they are right now. But their leading contributors along the way, surprisingly, they had 6 double-digit scorers for them. Russell Westbrook would average 14 points a game in the 3 games that he played. Daniel House would average 12 points and 6 rebounds in the game that he played. And Russell Westbrook would average 6.3 rebounds and 4 assists, by the way. Robert Covington would average 13 points, 5.5 rebounds, over an assist, over 2 steals, and over a block per game in 7 games. Jeff Green would average 13 points, 6 rebounds, and over an assist off the bench. Eric Gordon would average 18 points, 3 rebounds, 3 assists, and over a steal, almost a block per game as a starter. And James Harden would be the team's top scorer, averaging 29.7 points, 6.3 rebounds, 8 assists, over a steal. And that's how the Houston Rockets enter the series. To me, how long the series goes will depend on how quickly Russell Westbrook returns to form. If Russell Westbrook returns to form, preferably by beginning of Game 2 or Game 3, I think Houston could at least take this series 6 games. I think the Lakers are going to win regardless. If Russell Westbrook is still injured for this series, I think the Lakers probably sweep the Rockets. I think the Rockets played incredibly well against the Thunder, and the Rockets might even take the first 1 or 2 games, but I think the Lakers will get everything together because I think these 2 different teams are in 2 different leagues. But with that said, I think the Lakers win this series in at the least 4, at the most 6 games, and I truly think if the Lakers have it all together right now and they're fully rested, I think they can fully take advantage of this small ball Rockets team because Anthony Davis is still Anthony Davis. They still have Dwight Howard, JaVale McGee, some of the best rebounders in basketball, and their point guard is 6'8", 260 pounds. And side note, is arguably the best player that has ever touched a basketball in human history. So with that said, I think that's how it's going to go. And my prediction for the conference finals matchups, I think it's going to be the Lakers versus the Clippers in the West, and I think it's going to be the Milwaukee Bucks versus the Boston Celtics in the East. But with that said, I appreciate you once again for listening to this piece. Once again, it is Thursday, September 3rd, 2020 in this quarantine. I'm James Sims. This is The Elite. Thank you once again for listening to my piece, and peace out.